Yes. My name is Mike Leonard, and I'm filling in for Jim Bensley, the IAF director, who can't be here tonight. He's gone for the best of all possible reasons. His daughter is getting married, or actually got married last night. So when he returns, please congratulate him and Mary Kay. Some life events take priority. Tonight, we kick off the 29th season of IAF with an extraordinary topical presentation, the proliferation of authoritarian governments on both the right and the left of the political spectrum. Before we begin, if you haven't already done so, could you kindly turn off your cell phones or put them on the silent mode, please? It would be greatly appreciated. After the presentation, we'll be taking questions from the audience, both from home and those who have been joined us here. Tonight, we have as our presenter, Dr. Erica Frantz. Erica Frantz is an associate professor of political science at Michigan State University. She specializes in authoritarian politics with a focus on democratization, conflict, and development. She has published 7 books on these themes, including Authoritarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. In 2020, she won the MSU College of Social Science Outstanding Teacher Award. Prior to joining academia, she worked as a political analyst for a Washington think tank where she worked on evidence-based foreign policy approaches. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and private foundations. Our moderator is our own Dr. John Zachman. John is a professor of political science here at NMC. He holds a BA from Michigan State University and a Ph.D. from Duke University. So would you please join me in welcoming both Dr. Zachman and Dr. Frantz on what promises to be a fantastic discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. Dr. Erica Frantz, welcome to Northwestern Michigan College and to Traverse City. It sounds like this is not your first time here, so.
This is my second time here, so it's very nice to be back, and thank you so much for having me here.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to a great discussion tonight. And welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I believe this is the first time we've been in person probably since the pandemic started. So we've of course been carrying on, but it's nice to see faces here. And of course, as Michael said, this is a long tradition we have at the International Affairs Forum. So with that said, I want to get right into it. So our topic for tonight is autocracy and a tendency that we're currently seeing for democracies to backslide. And I guess let's just open with that. That trend right now, is this a major concern for us to see democracies backsliding into autocratic forms of government? What's happening in the world today?
I think it's first helpful to start out, with some basic trends that we're seeing in terms of changes over time in political systems. And as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, there has been a wave of democratic backsliding globally. By most indicators, levels of democracy or levels of freedom, depending on how it's measured, have declined over the last 15 consecutive years. And in some instances, the declines have been really large. In other instances, it's been more subtle. At the aggregate, globally, it has been somewhat subtle, but perhaps it's a theme in the news of late because we're seeing democracies backslide in some surprising places. And by that, I mean, we're seeing backsliding happening in countries that we're not used to of thinking as at risk of backsliding. So in general, it is safe to say that democracy is receding globally. but the severity of that decline is very much regionally dependent, country dependent, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Are there some countries that you could use as examples to show kind of what maybe the most concerning cases would be in terms of backsliding from democracy to autocracy? And then on the other hand, are there some countries that show maybe how there might be some slippage back, but they ultimately remain democracies?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're seeing democracies backslide in some surprising places. And in general, I would say that all instances of backsliding are cause for concern. There are many reasons to support democracy that are empirically supported in the literature in terms of outcomes that we might care about. But what is, I think, of note is the fact that democracies that are wealthier and that have a longer history of democratic rule are now at risk. So historically, there have been two major factors that social scientists know help protect democracy from backsliding. And the first of these is levels of wealth. So usually it's the case that as you have higher levels of wealth, you're more protected from that sort of reversion. The second main factor that helps to protect democracy is the number of years that you've had democratic rule. And both of these things are somewhat intuitive. So the more experience you have with democratic governance, the more protected you are from this sort of development. So those are kind of the two major factors that we think of are, nice and easy predictors of whether a country will be at risk of backsliding. And what we've seen is that a number of places that are perhaps not high income, but middle income have indeed backslid. And the most notable are perhaps Turkey, where Erdogan has spearheaded that process of backsliding from within, and then Hungary under Viktor Orban, which does not necessarily have quite a long history of democratic rule, but this is all somewhat relatively speaking. So though Hungary democratized in the 90s, that still is a longer period of democratic rule than, say, Burkina Faso. And so both of those places have been in the headlines for those reasons. Venezuela is another case where it was one of the most robust democracies of Latin America, and then slowly saw its democracy fall apart under Chavez. Of course, there's also, the country on everybody's mind, in this room probably, the United States, which by all indicators has experienced democratic backsliding since 2016. Other cases include parts of Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so forth. So these are all, I think one of the reasons why democratic backsliding is on the minds of so many people and in the news so frequently is that it's happening in these surprising places. We're used to seeing this sort of ebb and flow occur in places that are either poorer or that have shorter experiences with democratic governance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In terms of the economic factors here, the United States, of course, is a very wealthy country, incredibly diverse economy, very large middle class. That seems to be a protective factor in general. With countries that have wealth where you see really high Gini coefficients, or where you have maybe wealth derived from natural resources such as oil and natural gas, does that seem to be less protective in terms of democratic government? So I'm thinking of like a country like Saudi Arabia, which is obviously not democratic. They may have a fairly high level of wealth to some degree, but that's not a country I would predict where wealth is going to help to protect democracy. So, this is kind of, to go back to, let's say, Aristotle, a middle class is pretty important for a democracy. Is that what we're looking at with the wealth factor, or is it something a bit more complex than that?
So to be very clear, we don't totally know the ways in which wealth protects democracy. We know that it shows up in all the models as doing so, but the causal pathways are somewhat disputed. There is some evidence that, you mentioned Gini coefficients, that's the fancy way of talking about economic inequality. There's some evidence that inequality is important for that equality, the flip, is important for stabilizing democracy, and that inequality can perhaps be a barrier to democratic consolidation. But it's a complex pathway. Unfortunately, the data on economic inequality are somewhat spotty, so we have to say a lot of things with some levels of hesitation. In terms of the other economic factor you mentioned, oil wealth, most studies indicate that oil wealth helps protect the system that's in place. And it helps protect the system whether it's a democracy or whether it's an authoritarian system. So you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and one of the reasons why this monarchic system has been so durable is indeed because they have all of this oil wealth. If you can distribute oil rents or the income you get from oil profits to your coalition of supporters and keep them, your system is going to be stable. And the same sort of dynamic is also true in democracies, particularly when they're savvy about how they use that oil income. But in democracies, it's less likely that the state is going to have full control over the oil industry, so their ability to use oil in a manner that's protective is slightly different than in an authoritarian setting.
Right, right. In Venezuela would be then a country where we had some level of democracy, and they lost it with a personalistic ruler, Hugo Chavez, coming to power.
Yes, I mean, essentially, in Venezuela, Chavez used that oil income to get what he wanted. And in this case, what he wanted was a full control over this system. He didn't want checks and balances. I don't know if it's fair to say that he wanted authoritarianism. I mean, we'll never really know what goes on inside the minds of political leaders, but he certainly wanted power in his hands explicitly, like many other political leaders. And he was able to use the oil wealth, particularly when oil prices were high, to make sure that he could pad the pockets of those individuals whose support he needed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's turn now maybe to kind of the nature of some of these rulers and personalistic rule, and how that relates here. I also want to transition and talk a little bit about political parties as well. So, you mentioned with the case of the United States, we might look at backsliding really kind of starting in 2016. That obviously would correlate very much with kind of a populist, personalistic ruler that we're talking about in terms of President Trump. I mean, on the one hand, just to kind of bracket a question that we can attack at some point in time, to what extent did we already see maybe this tendency in the United States even before 2016? But with that said, so a personalistic ruler, and then also a Republican Party that's, I think, worth thinking about, and how our party system relates. This may also kind of connect to Hungary, because I read one of your papers from recently that talked a little bit about the way that personalistic rulers can potentially create parties and how that impacts this whole dynamic.
There's a lot to unpack there, so and so much I want to say. I think I'm going to backpedal a little bit, and because you mentioned, how this process is happening. And it's very important to differentiate the way that this process has changed since the end of the Cold War in particular. We're using the term democratic backsliding, and those of you who have been attuned to the news of late are going to be thinking probably of a slower process, as we have witnessed in a number of places. But it's important to remember that usually up until the 1990s, democracies fell apart or backslid because of coups, of military intervention. So would-be authoritarians during that era, their method of taking power was to stage a military coup. And that was this very abrupt process. It was usually not the incumbent executing it, but an outside group. And it was very clear the moment during which the democracy had collapsed. So the date of the coup, democracy is no more. Then with the end of the Cold War, there were a number of developments that happened that made it less palpable or less desirable for would-be authoritarians to use a military force as their means for taking over. And there are a variety of reasons for this, such as domestic audiences having more support for democracy than they did in the past, as well as foreign actors withdrawing foreign aid if a country experienced a military coup. So the use of this sort of abrupt force to take control and establish authoritarianism has really declined. And instead, we're seeing this really long and slow, drawn-out process that's happening at the hands of democratically elected leaders. So this makes it a lot more difficult to distinguish the date during which the takeover has happened. It's a lot more difficult for people who'd like to protect and preserve democracy to do something to push back against the event, which we can get into later. But you mentioned a number of leaders and their support parties and the ways in which that is part of the new process. So elected leaders taking control, and then we have this slow effort that they pursue to consolidate power. It usually begins, I said I had a lot to say. So,
that's quite all right.
It usually begins with these leaders starting to chip away at checks to their rule. So it's not like they get elected and then the next midterm election they cheat and steal the election. Instead, they do these subtle things to make sure that those checks and balances that we like to see in a healthy democracy deteriorate and that they have greater control. And as I mentioned, most leaders, we assume from rational choice theory or what have you, would like to maximize power, so perhaps we shouldn't be that surprised. But this gets to your point about political parties. So whereas in the past you might have seen a military junta be the support group that launched this new leader into power, today we're seeing that it's the incumbent party that paves the way for this sort of transition to authoritarianism. And you mentioned personalism. Another big theme today that I can get into, we're seeing a rise of personalist rule globally that I can talk about both in democracies and autocratic settings. But what we think helps facilitate this consolidation of control, this getting rid of checks and balances, is a somewhat weak political party, either weak or internally factionalized. So kind of a long answer to your question. So that party might be personalistic in nature, where power is concentrated with the leader, or it might be that there's so many internal divisions that the leader is able to capitalize on that and push through with their agenda.
Excellent, excellent. Well, and I mean, and so in relation to the United States, certainly, the Republican Party is quite an interesting case study because, we have tended to have fairly weak parties. You don't have central control so much. We have primaries to select candidates, et cetera, which would contrast if you looked at a parliamentary system like Britain's, for example, where the party has a lot of control over who their candidates are. And so that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of weak parties. And also just anticipating where we're going in this country. Are there some examples that you could give us in terms of around the world of weak parties that kind of speak to this point?
Yeah, and I should emphasize that I study comparative politics, so the United States is not my country of expertise. I say this all the time, but I was never asked to speak about American politics until the last few years. Nobody cared about my research on authoritarianism. Now suddenly everyone's interested. But I'm much more comfortable talking about things that are happening outside of the U.S. in places that are prone to authoritarianism. So there are a number of high-profile cases where weak parties have served as a springboard for authoritarianism. And I should say that when I'm talking about weak parties, I'm talking really weak parties. So the U.S. might have weaker parties than, say, other consolidated democracies, but compared to the parties in a place, like Ecuador, our parties actually seem pretty institutionalized. They have policy agendas that are not totally wedded to what the leader wants. There's local branches and so forth. But a nice recent case of a country that I think is going to be the model, well, that's not a good thing, but it is serving as the model for the way I think that this process is going to play out in the years to come, is El Salvador, which is democratic still to this day. But my bet would, if I were, with someone who gambled, my bet would be that it is at a very high risk of transitioning to authoritarianism. And here we have a leader, Bukele, who created his own political party. And that is a really clear red flag. When a leader gets elected who created their own political party, it's an easily observable red flag that democracy is at risk, regardless of what that leader might say is part of their policy agenda. It usually means that that party cannot serve as a check to that leader's ambitions, and the leader, if the leader pushes through with policy proposals that are threatening to democracy, it's going to be more likely that they get passed through by the incumbent party. So Bukele creates his own Nueva Ideas party right before running for president. Now, he was a member of a more traditional party prior, but a variety of things happened. He couldn't run with that party, runs for president. launches a campaign exclusively on social media, does not need to rely on an established institution, party institution, to get the word out about his candidacy, wins power, is hugely popular, and has slowly paved the way for that country to be at risk of authoritarianism. So by weak, I mean, this is a really weak party. The N for Nueva Ideas, their logo is an N, and the N does not stand for Nueva Ideas. It stands for Nayib, which is his first name. So that's party personalism at its finest. Other examples where the leader created their own movement and then we saw democracy fall apart would be Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, as we talked about with his Bolivarian movement. That movement was intricately linked to Chavez's persona. We've seen that Maduro has really struggled to have that same sort of legitimacy. Hungary with the Fidesz coalition created by Orban. Turkey with Erdogan. Erdogan was one of the founding members. So there's a commonality here where when a leader creates their own party, we see that that party just does not have the same sort of institutional strength to do much when that leader gets elected.
You know, it strikes me that the role of ideology here doesn't seem to be central, right? It seems like if looking at previous authoritarian regimes, that if you really want to carry on past your own death, you might want to create an ideology that can then be followed. Like if I think of somebody like Lenin and the Soviet Union. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing, is that right? Or, I mean, these tend to be autocratic rulers where the rule is somewhat free of kind of this ideological, or do some of them create ideologies in this process?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's very much a nuanced, ideology plays a nuanced role in the way this all has been happening. For one, it's important to note that this sort of incumbent-led takeover is happening from both the left and the right. We have left-wing leaders such as Chavez doing this. Hungary would be on the other pole. So we don't necessarily, it's not like this is a leftist or rightist thing. However, these leaders are really strategic in their use of ideology as a means of solidifying control. So it's not necessarily that they are ideologues and are, really care about these things as much as, maybe they are, I don't know, but they seem to really be strategic in their use of ideology as a mobilizer. In some instances, they might view ideology or religion, let's say, as somewhat threatening. They don't want to see a rival group mobilize on ideological or religious grounds. But they do tend to adhere to some sort of ideological persuasion that they think can help them solidify control. And often embedded in this is this sort of cult of personality, where they are the individual that's going to save the country. Sometimes they print their face on currency. There's all sorts of things that they do to really try to make people feel like this is the strong leader that we need. Our country can't survive without this person. Anytime, though, that a party or movement is inextricably linked to the individual personality of one person, that is a threat to democracy. And I can get into some of the reasons later. But ideology, in my view, is something that leaders strategically use for their own political benefit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think of somebody like Putin, who certainly doesn't have a very thick ideology behind his rule, but at the same time has a certain kind of appeal to history and tradition and nationalism and Russian identity, I think ultimately, but it's not a thick ideology like we would have had under the Soviet Union. With that said, though, and just conscious of time, I want to pivot a little bit to one of the mechanisms by which I think rulers or would-be dictators today can directly communicate to the people, and that's through social media, digital media, because that's certainly a variable that has changed radically over the last 20 years. And yes. So is this a common theme where, in terms of the backsliding that we see over the past couple of decades, the ability to communicate directly through social media is a big factor?
Yes, that's another great question. So to be clear, academic researchers have lagged in terms have not been able to keep pace with the rapidity through which democracies are falling apart. So, we try to gather data and test our expectations about things, but we are somewhat lagging behind. We have some general ideas about the factors that are paving the way for democratic backsliding globally. And indeed, one thing we think might be influencing the rise of personalism, specifically in the demise of more programmatic sorts of political parties, is indeed social media. And the reason is that social media, as you mentioned, gives leaders a quick and easy tool for communicating with large groups of people and getting their message out. It basically negates the need for a political party. Political parties originally formed as a means to help leaders in various parts of a country get their message out, coordinate, and so forth. Well, you no longer need that to win office, and Bukele exemplifies this really well, that you can rely on social media rather than a party organization. Well, this leads to these very weak and pithy parties that lack much more than a skeleton, and as a result, policy choices end up becoming a reflection of the whims of the individual leader, which can lead to more volatile policies. It can lead to less fact-checking. There's no vetting happening within the party. There's no vetting in terms of what policy choices are good ideas or bad. And in authoritarian settings, we've seen that this sort of concentration of power is very harmful for political outcomes. Everything that has happened in Russia under Putin is consistent with what the research shows about personalism in autocracies. So to the extent that social media has really given way to these weak political parties that are personality-based, it is indeed a detriment to democracy. And that's kind of a depressing message because it's a beast that really, how do we control social media and so forth? That, I have no idea. But we are seeing that leaders are using social media in very savvy ways that negates the need for political parties. And that has contributed to personalism in politics.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of thinking aloud here, it seems to me that with the dynamic of social media, one of the concerns I certainly would have would be social institutions that used to structure lives, and if those have diminished, then that opens a door for social media to play a role in people's lives that used to be fulfilled in other ways, right? So that, for example, if a person used to spend more time going to church or going to the bowling alley or going to, engage with the community in other ways, that they wouldn't be as drawn to fulfilling their social needs on social media, which is to say, to look at how societies have how social institutions have functioned within societies. And it's, so just thinking with the United States, it worries me a little bit because certainly our social institutions in many ways are struggling now in a way that I don't know they would have been 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's very possible that there are these sorts of micro level, individual level pathways through which social media is influencing how individuals behave, the types of leaders that they're attracted to. That falls outside of my area of expertise, but it seems like a compelling argument to me. I think on the flip side, we should be very much attuned to the way in which top-down efforts or top-down political leaders are paving the way for authoritarianism, and the ways in which social media is enabling this top-down effort to polarize individual citizens, to spread false information, to put out narratives that have not been vetted and so forth in ways that help these individuals consolidate power. So I think of a lot of these things as being driven by political elites and working in tandem with some of the micro-level pathways that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and those political elites are certainly not confined to manipulating their own environments, right? I mean, if we think of Russia and China, for example, and the way that they use social media in the United States to manipulate public opinion to outcomes that they want, I mean, can be a fairly scary prospect moving forward.
I have done a lot of work recently on digital authoritarianism and digital repression and the ways in which authoritarians are using new technologies to support their rule. And it is all, unfortunately, it's very depressing in that we can't keep pace with the way in which mainly China the ways in which they are adapting new technologies to serve their interests. Russia is the classic case where there's more transnational efforts, but it's certainly something to be attuned to. I've done a lot of consulting work on this issue, and the government is aware that this is something that we need to be attuned to, but the ways in which outside actors are able to influence domestic affairs has certainly changed with the advent of these new technologies.
Concerning outcomes, so I mean, this week has been a good week in some ways, right? And I'm thinking of Ukraine right now, and authoritarian leaders at times being less capable than democratic leaders. And so the insulation that Putin may have from other actors in Russian society, it just occurs to me that that may have led to some bad decision making. And so what I'm kind of getting at here is maybe a ray of hope, but I'm not so sure it's going to be, because I have a feeling it's still it's not going to be much of a ray of hope. But the idea would be that authoritarian, autocratic rulers, because they don't have to respond to democratic influences like what the majority want, for example, or specific kind of policy preferences that have been vetted through rigorous kind of party competition, that in the long run they may perform more poorly than democracies. And that seems to me like a really big question that all of us have in this world today, especially given how successful China has been, of course, as an authoritarian government. So am I justified in having a ray of hope as I look at Ukraine? I mean, certainly I'm justified just insofar as I want Ukraine to do well, doing well, but, or should I be a little bit more pessimistic that that's gonna ultimately be a check on this kind of rule?
So, I mean, I concur that developments this week in Ukraine give us a little ray of hope. However, because of the particular dynamics of the political system in Russia, Putin is likely to be able to withstand quite a bit before things really change for him. That's another, I can talk about Russia and its vulnerabilities in quite a bit of detail if you'd like. But in general, as I mentioned, the behavior of Putin towards Ukraine, towards the international community, domestically, is all consistent with what we know about personalist dictatorships, where power is concentrated. And to be clear, not all authoritarian systems are like this. So let's think about China post-Mao up until Xi Jinping. It was pretty much more of a collegial system. There were more checks on that leadership. So authoritarian systems differ quite a bit. And the authoritarian systems that are personalist, where power is concentrated, there is a large body of research that shows that they do all sorts of harmful things. So they're more likely to be corrupt. They are the least likely to democratize. They are the most likely to engage in risky foreign policy behavior. They are the most likely to escalate foreign conflicts. They are less likely to back down in disputes. It goes on, and I mean, I could keep going. And all of this is because of this, the freedom to do as you please can lead to some very interesting behaviors. But interestingly, though leaders are trying to get rid of checks on their rule and all sorts of things, this personalistic environment, Vladimir Putin at the head of this table, I don't know if you all saw this in the media, alone, and his military generals are at the end of the table. This leads to significant paranoia. He ends up surrounding himself with yes men. Only those people whose positions, who agree with him can speak. They're at fear of being punished if they say the wrong thing. So everybody's going to say what he wants to hear. He does not get accurate intelligence about what's going on. And it creates this environment of paranoia, of poor choices, and so forth. This also played out with Saddam Hussein in Iraq and ultimately led to his demise. Personalists are bad. Personalism is on the rise globally. That's the negative story. And I mentioned in authoritarian systems as well. So to the extent that we can be attuned to this reality and the factors that contribute to personalism, it could help improve efforts to preserve these institutions that help keep individual impulses in check.
So it sounds like the people that live under personalistic regimes are, in general, in for a world of hurt because of the fact that your rule is going to be less effective in terms of managing society. So when we think of China's successes from Deng forward, up and Xi seems to be a bit different right now. That's because the Chinese Communist Party ruled very much as a authoritarian party, as opposed to a personalistic dictator.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, even under Xi, since we've seen him try to concentrate power, that's the consensus among China experts, he's been riskier in his foreign policy aggression. He's ratcheted up repression domestically. All of these things are what you would expect with personalism. So it's definitely not a good development. I tell my students, if you had to choose, if you had to choose a form of authoritarianism to live under, you want to be in Singapore, not in Russia. So that sort of collegial rule can help protect a lot of different things that we might care about as ordinary citizens.
Excellent. Let's see, we have, I think, time for a little bit more before we get to our question and answer period. So I'm interested in countries around the world that you would kind of flag for us to have our eyes on. I mean, I'm thinking maybe of Brazil at this point in time, and I'm also, I guess I'm concerned that if this trend continues and becomes more widespread, is this something that the kind of the world order is going to be altered by it? I mean, as political scientists, we can talk about the third wave of democratization and kind of the 70s and 80s and 90s being kind of high times where, you know, Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, and we know where we're going. And in 2022, it doesn't really seem like we know where we're going. And it seems like that there's a great danger that countries that, you know, like Brazil is not a democracy like the United States with an extremely long history. It has a significant history, but I worry that it's going to be a part of a wave that's in the wrong direction. So what countries might you flag for us to kind of have on our radar screen moving forward? And then how concerned would you be that this is going to kind of alter the nature of maybe world politics?
Okay, so in terms of the places that are at risk, Brazil is an excellent case, and it is anomalous on some levels because, as you mentioned, it is middle income, and you know they democratized in 1985 or something like that. So it had a number of years of democracy under its belt, but we're seeing democratic backsliding under Bolsonaro for sure, and the next election will certainly be a pressure point for Brazilian democracy. As I started this out, a lot of the places that are backsliding are in surprising places, and they tend to be in countries that are pretty powerful internationally. Brazil is a major player in the international scene, the same thing with India, obviously the United States. So the extent to which the world order might be transformed, there's definitely a possibility. I've talked to colleagues who are involved with the US government's efforts to promote democracy overseas, and those efforts have been challenged by the Trump administration, according to their on-the-ground staff. So it's difficult to say that you're trying to advocate for democracy when people in that country of interest say, well, how can you speak about this when you have X, Y, and Z happening? So it is possible that we see a transformation because these big players are experiencing some internal difficulties. But I think that there's also some really good stuff happening globally, and that is that democracies still outnumber dictatorships. So there's more dictatorships in the world than democracies. Democratic transitions still outpace transitions to dictatorship. The difference, though, is that the rate at which they're outpacing them is changing. So the tide could be turning where now we see more transitions to dictatorship than transitions to democracy. And it's very encouraging to me as a comparative politics scholar that we're seeing quite a bit of success in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of levels of democracy there. So that's a region that has seen more increases in democracy than decreases in its countries. And that should give us a good reason to be optimistic that this is a large, a significant number of people live in that region. This is a region that has traditionally struggled with democracy, but we're seeing some gains. Those gains don't always make the news. When the Gambia democratizes, it's not necessarily headline news, but it certainly is something that should, there is an optimistic note in that regard, that we are seeing still that democracies outnumber dictatorships, and that a number of places that have struggled have democratized in recent years.
Excellent, excellent. Michael, shall I hand it over to you and we can go to the audience for questions at this point in time?
Only briefly, are we going to hand it over to me because we're going to listen to the audience. So if we could have a little bit more light, please, so we can see some of the folks out there. It's a handsome group tonight, I must say. Also for the group at home, sitting in their jammies and drinking a glass of wine, to some extent we envy you. But please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you might have. So let's see who has the first question. It looks like we have one over here.
All right. So one question I have, and I have to preface two things before I say this. One, I understand that it is in human nature when humans are not the kind of species to solve a problem until it reaches a head. Like the sinking of the Titanic made us reevaluate ship safety, things like that. 9/11 made us reevaluate security. And also the last 2 years of my high school experience were during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, and same thing for college. And I continuously kept trying to warn all my friends on both sides of the political spectrum that if Trump lost the election, he would stage a violent coup to reinstate himself in power. Everybody called me an alarmist, and I need to know what are the best ways to convince people, that you're being serious and that this is a genuine threat, that this needs to be paid attention to, instead of making them think that you're just a crazy alarmist nut job. So what could I have done differently?
First of all, it sounds like you should have a career in political advising because you were able to anticipate quite a bit there. That's very impressive. So, this is kind of $1 million question domestically. I'm an expert in authoritarianism. I can tell someone that the research says that the United States is fitting in trend with countries that are democratic backsliding, that all experts say that the US is experiencing democratic backsliding. But if somebody is dead set on not agreeing with that, they just aren't going to agree with it. We're no longer living in a landscape where facts matter so much, where expert opinion is respected. There's allegations that you're biased. Bias is the last thing that I'd want to be. I like to talk about research, not my own political views and so forth. But all experts that study democracies and autocracies assert that the US has experienced backsliding since 2016. That there is a threat to American democracy, particularly in terms of things such as oversight and transparency, politicization of the judiciary, interference in local elections, intimidation of poll workers, and so on and so on. I don't think you're necessarily going to be able to convince someone of these things. I think that the best, and this is just, off the cuff, but your best strategy is really to focus on, okay, well, what can we all agree on? We want to have a situation where poll workers are not intimidated and harassed. I think everybody could agree, yeah. I did have evidence. Oh, I'm not saying you didn't. I'm saying we're living in a landscape where evidence doesn't necessarily matter quite as much in terms of informing political debates. So, what are the things we can agree on? We should be able to agree on that we want free and fair elections where those who are able to can vote, where there aren't extraordinary obstacles to voting. We can agree on that, poll workers should not be intimidated. You can have the focal point be on those things and take it from there. I always say you want to live in a system where the person that you, like the leader that you really, really can't stand, who's like your mortal enemy, could get elected and not have the entire system change in terms of the nature of political outcomes and policy choices. So, everybody likes to think about how they want the political system to work when the guy that or lady that they like is in office. But you need to think about what sorts of institutional checks you'd like to have in place if your mortal enemy got in power, and for there to be mechanisms of accountability and so forth.
All right, next question, please. Over here, this gentleman. Go ahead, keep going. There you go. He's got his hand up.
Thank you. You started out your talk by noting that prosperity is protective of democracy, and it's certainly true that around the world, democracy and prosperity are highly correlated. But authoritarian rulers or would-be authoritarian rulers promise prosperity too, and sometimes they promise that authoritarianism is a shortcut to prosperity. So my question is this: when we look around the world, as we see that there are authoritarian rulers who are failing to deliver on prosperity, as in Turkey, as in China within the last year or two, just as Xi's about to grab his third term, the economy is falling apart, Russia to some extent. Is this something that is going to give hope? The economic failures of authoritarianism, does that give us hope, or that these countries will return to democracy or evolve toward democracy? Or is that just going to collapse into the abyss and things will become worse and worse? The failure of authoritarianism to deliver on its promises is going to make matters even worse.
That's a great question. So on the one hand, I don't mean to say that the preferences of ordinary people don't matter, but we do know that elite politics drives a lot of the functioning of authoritarian stability. So to the extent that authoritarian leaders can keep their inner circle happy, the security forces happy, they can maintain power for quite a long time. And you see that in a number of instances. Venezuela is a great example. The economy has totally fallen apart, and yet Maduro is still hanging on. He's got the support of the security services and so forth. So on the one hand, authoritarian systems can be remarkably resilient in the face of economic crisis. On the other hand, their resilience is context dependent. So we know that dominant party-based dictatorships, such as China under the Communist Party, Vietnam, Singapore, they tend to have more mechanisms in place for withstanding economic crises than more places where power is more concentrated. So if you were to have, an economic crisis in China versus one in Venezuela, the odds would be in favor of the Chinese regime being more likely to survive, for a lot of different reasons that have to do with the ability to still provide goods to local level actors. Okay, so on the one hand, dictatorships vary in terms of their vulnerability to economic crisis. On the other hand, and this is something that we as scholars don't have a solid grip on, we do know that there are triggering events where the economic crisis has simply become too much for ordinary citizens. And we see a protest erupt. And we see that protest suddenly destabilize a leadership. And then out of nowhere, the regime is overthrown. Academics did a very poor job of predicting the Arab Spring, for example. Tunisia, you could say that was a case of, really dire economic situation or economic conditions serving as the trigger for the protests, and then those protests happen to work. We know a little bit about when protests are likely to work, but there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of when that sort of, real fury over an economic crisis is likely to lead to a regime change. And then unfortunately, sometimes regime change happens and you just see a new dictatorship. So we would definitely say that economic crisis elevates the baseline risk that an authoritarian regime will be overthrown, but it's not a guarantee.
Okay, we're going to take this question from our virtual audience. Kevin Bishop asks, it appears that aspiring autocrats drive their followers to thinking in very simple us versus them context and description of a very dark future if they are not put into power. Your thoughts?
Yes, that is exactly what's happening. And this is, again, part of this new wave. We had populists in the past who, would use these sorts of messages, but it's very much has become in vogue now that we see democracies falling apart at the hands of incumbents. So there are a variety of strategies that these leaders use to consolidate control, to mobilize their supporters. One, and it all falls under like a populist sort of agenda, using us versus them language. I mentioned polarization briefly. Polarization is many times a process that's driven from above, where leaders are strategically splintering society to benefit themselves. We know a lot of reasons why polarization can facilitate backsliding. So savvy leaders are going to try to polarize. They promote messages that you need a strong leader. That, well, strong leadership means you don't need executive constraints. That's pretty convenient. They say that you should mistrust experts, that the established institutions can't be trusted anymore. Well, that paves the way for them to, purge the people that they don't like. All of these things are part of the toolkit, I guess you could say, for how today's would-be authoritarians are dismantling democracy from within. So yes, us versus them is very much an intentional strategy that leaders are using to polarize domestic audiences and mobilize their supporters.
All right, a question from this gentleman right here. We'll get you the mic, sir. It's being recorded. There we go.
My name is Jainal Abedin. I am from South Asian country of Bangladesh, bordering India and Myanmar. With 180 million population, we are the 8th largest country in the world, and more than Russia or Japan. I had to flee my country because of the regime. My question to Professor Erica is that we know India is the largest democracy in the world. Unfortunately, this Indian regimes, consecutive regimes, promoting autocracy in Bangladesh. And it is open secret, the current regime started there in the name of democracy, that destroying rule of law. There is no justice system in our country. My friend Ghulam had to flee 5 years back. I had to flee because we spoke against the government. And my question to Erica is that, are you aware about that India is promoting autocracy around their neighbors? And fortunately, United States government recently sanctioned some of our government officials, those enforced, because of enforced disappearance and all this. So our next election is 2023. So if this election is not going to help properly, so Bangladesh is going to be another autocratic regime like Myanmar. So what is your suggestion, and how can we promote democracy and rule of law in Bangladesh? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. So, I'm not a specialist in Bangladesh or Indian politics. We know that India is, as you mentioned, the world's largest democracy, also that it's been experiencing backsliding under Modi. It is not unheard of for a democracy to meddle in the affairs of another country and promote authoritarianism. In fact, the US in the Cold War. So this is something that happens, and we like to think that because a country has free and fair elections that are used to select the leadership, my definition of democracy, that it means that we're going to see all of these good, rosy outcomes. That might not happen, and it particularly might not happen if that democracy sees it as in its strategic interest to get a specific group in power in another country or to promote a particular agenda in another country. So, it's unfortunate if these developments are occurring in the way that they're happening, but democracy does not necessarily preserve democracy in a country's borders. In terms of, the future of democracy in Bangladesh, I can't necessarily speak to that. We know that these sorts of developments are happening in a lot of places. And most of the research that I know of looks at domestic factors. We don't know that much about how these international factors might intersect to put democracies at risk. So this is certainly an avenue for future research, looking at the ways in which external forces might destabilize democracies.
All right, and I'm going to take the question from this lady right here that just raised her hand, but I'm also going to say something to our NMC students who are attending tonight. We don't go home tonight until one NMC student asks a question. Go ahead, ma'am. Yeah, but you did before I put that thread out, so it's...
My question tags on what this other gentleman was mentioning about India in a way. I'm wondering how fintech is potentially a new form of global autocracy. And I think of it in terms of India in particular, with Modi changing things for the very poor people, having to have new kinds of identities that are facial recognition, fingerprinting, and so on in order to have any kind of bank account. So the combination of big bank and big tech globally, because there isn't really a national loyalty there, it's more to profit. How is that a new form of autocracy?
So I mentioned, I've done some work on digital authoritarianism, and I know quite a bit about how authoritarians are using new technologies to enhance their powers. The way that it's working in democracies, we know quite a bit less about. And this is a new field. We now have data on digital repression and so forth, so things are opening up. But we don't totally know the ways in which democracies are using new technologies. In most or many instances of democratic backsliding, we've also seen an uptick in digital repression happening at the same time. However, we don't know we don't know the direction of causality. We don't, in some instances, the ratcheting up of restrictions on new technologies happened before the backsliding episode. There's a lot of uncertainty. However, it is safe to say that there are many opportunities for aspiring authoritarians to use new technologies and ways to support themselves. They can use them for under the guise of the need to surveil and protect ordinary citizens from threats. They can start to monitor their opponents. They can start getting involved in internet filtering and censorship. And they can often do so under a narrative of protecting ordinary people. There are myriad of ways in which aspiring autocrats can use new technologies to support themselves. Facial recognition, and there are, the Chinese regime is holding conferences with other countries about how to use new technologies. All sorts of things are happening. It's not easy, or it's not difficult to figure out how to do this. And in the past, whereas if you wanted to get a big repressive apparatus together, you needed to staff individual people and train them. Now all you need to do is buy those technologies and implement them. It's extremely easy. Everything has been supercharged. So the ways in which democracies can protect democracy via regulations on new technologies and their spread, this is very much an important thing to be attuned to. And very few people have great solutions for how to deal with it. It's kind of like preventing the proliferation of nuclear technologies in terms of the difficulties of enforcement and so forth. But yes, this is definitely a threat and something that we're going to be seeing happening more frequently.
Okay, this question is from our virtual audience and member, and it's, what is your opinion on North Korea? And do you think anything will change in the coming years?
North Korea makes me so sad because North Koreans on average are shorter than South Koreans, even though they have the exact same ethnic backgrounds and so forth. So why are they shorter? Well, there's so much malnutrition that it has resulted in lower average heights. And yet, despite the very clear not delivering, we mentioned whether these authoritarian systems could deliver, North Korea is not delivering in any way, and yet the regime has persisted for quite a long time. So it's very depressing, and at the same time, the solution to dealing with North Korea is not easy. It's complicated even further by the nuclear technologies that are evolving there and the extent to which they can be deployed to protect North Korea. So this is not an easy answer for the international community to address. They can't simply mobilize and pressure the regime out. The only thing that I can say is that to the extent that power grows more personalized under Kim Jong-un, that could potentially lead the way for regime change should he die or leave power. We didn't talk about it, but personalists' concentration of power extends the lifetime of the regime. But once that leader dies or leaves office for other reasons, the regime is very much at vulnerability for collapse. So leadership changes are the Achilles heel of the personalist regime. So to the extent that things persist as they are, the regime could be under threat at the time of a leadership succession, but it should be stable, unfortunately, for many years to come.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Do we have an NMC student with a question? Oh, all the way in the back. Oh, all the way in the back there with their hand up in the black t-shirt. Right, okay. There's some excitement too. Go ahead.
All right. Hello. Okay, damn. Sorry. Would you say that there are any like early warning signs that ordinary citizens can look out for if they're worried about their democracy turning into an autocracy? And is there anything that like ordinary people can do?
Great question, and an important one. So I mentioned that when leaders create their own political party, it is a red flag. One of the anomalies is France under Macron, where he created it on March, and they seem to be okay. But usually when leaders get elected with a personalist party, it's a red flag. And that should also translate to a situation where if you have somebody on the ballot who's supported by a personalist party or who makes politics all about them as an individual, that's a red flag. Once leaders get elected to office, if you see them doing things to try to sideline constraints to their rule, that's problematic. Politicization of the judiciary is very bad. It can often lead to a situation where there's efforts to change the Constitution in ways that favor the dictatorship. Then you or favor that leader, and then this then leads the way for things like messing with the electoral rules in ways that ensure that the leader's party gets a majority. There's a lot of things that can happen that are negative when the judiciary is no longer, a reliable check on the leadership. The same thing is true with the bureaucracy. Efforts to reduce oversight on the bureaucracy are troublesome. We need our bureaucracies to play, their role in our democracy. And then in terms of like, what can you do? On some levels, it's limited how much we can do when there are a lot of the responsibility in almost all of these cases that I've seen lies with the incumbent party and their malaise, I guess you could say, in terms of pushing back against a power grab. But, I mentioned local elections. Local elections are important, and there should be, it should be a valence issue. Everyone should agree that you want to make sure that that electoral contest is free and fair, that people aren't intimidated, that there's not vote buying, that there's not a biased media coverage of one candidate over the other. So to the extent that you can take action and support a healthy local level election, that could make a difference. In the larger scheme, research shows that accountability institutions are really critical for preventing backsliding from progressing once it's started. That's kind of like vague political science language. But, I mentioned the judiciary. You want checks and balances that can prevent this sort of thing from happening.
Okay, Dr. Frantz is much too modest, but you need to read her book. So here's what we're going to do, because you asked that question. We have 5 copies out there. I will pay for your copy. You pick it up. Alex, make sure he gets a copy of the book. All right. Thank you, Dr. Frantz and Dr. Zachman. Democracies fail. Oh, wow, let's just give them a round of applause. And while you're in the mood, let's take a moment to recognize students from NMC's audio technology program. These young folks are interns in the audio tech program, and they're gaining real-world experience at tonight's live event. They're guided by the indispensable Maria Ulrich, audio tech instructor, and our auditorium tech for this evening. Let's give them a round of applause. And before we move away from this evening's event, I'll remind you that Dr. Frantz's book, Authoritarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know, is available at our terrific local bookstores. We also have a few copies for sale in the library as you depart the building. I have nothing against Jeff Bezos, but buy in a store with a door if you can, okay? Now, let's tell you about the rest of our fall season. Many of you recall that last winter, we surveyed our membership to find out what was important to you. The 3 messages came out loud and clear. You wanted speakers who provided recommended solutions to the challenges facing the globe. You wanted to get back into in-person presentations provided safely in local venues, and you wanted to hear compelling speakers who could provide different and sometimes opposing perspectives. Well, we listened. On October 20th, we're going to host our first ever Oxford-style debate. Population migrations are occurring all over the globe. Some are driven by conflict, others by climate change or lack of resources. Our borders are no exception. The need for comprehensive immigration reform has been recognized by both parties, but there is no agreement on what that reform should look like. We've invited two terrific speakers to describe their vision of comprehensive immigration reform. Teresa Cardinal Brown is the Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. David Aguilar is the former Acting Commissioner for Customs and Border Protection and Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. What we expect that evening is a serious discussion of comprehensive immigration reform and the ramifications of our public policy decisions. Then on November 8th, we return to Ukraine, but with a twist. It's becoming obvious that the war between Russia and Ukraine may do more to reset the global world order than any event since World War II. We've invited Ambassador John Kornblum to describe what that new world order might look like. Ambassador Kornblum was the U.S. ambassador to Germany and is a recognized expert on U.S.-European political and economic relations. The moderator will be our own Jack Siegel, who needs no introduction to this audience. Now let me conclude by asking you a favor. You loyal members stood by us through COVID crisis, so thank you. Not all programs like this one survived. While COVID isn't over, we have learned to manage it. Look to your left and right. We need to fill any of those empty seats, and we need your help to do it. Invite your friends. Get them to become members. We intend to continue to offer the live stream option for those cold winter nights when you want to sit at home, but we want to give you the options so you will not miss an IAF event. We need you to clone yourselves and invite an intelligent, curious, and engaged citizens like you, and of all ages, I might add, because we need, because we're keeping the live streams open, we're no longer limited by geography. If you drive to Florida this winter, you can still enjoy the International Affairs Forum. We're going to focus on solutions. We aren't pretending we're going to solve the world's problems, but each of us can make a positive difference in this world, and we want to give you the tools to do it. We'll provide messages of optimism and hope, in addition to scaring the children. Dr. Frantz has agreed to stick around for a while tonight to talk to our leadership circle as well. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and if you're part of that leadership circle, either stay close or check your inbox for the Zoom link. And for all of your audience tonight, whether you're an IAF member or whether you're just checking us out, thank you for coming. Thank you for your engagement. Drive safely as you return home, and above all, make a difference in this world. Go forth and do great things. Thank you.